Welcome to our Shalom Learning Center 10-minute Lectorium, where we discuss the history of Judaism and Jewish people as the instrument to understand the New Testament and more than the New Testament. And so this is lecture 14, and we are discussing the emergence of Rabbinic Judaism. This is basically the development of Judaism of the 1st century BC, 1st century AD. It is interesting that in the rabbinic tradition there is a statement which is found in tractate Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, which starts like this. Moses received the Torah on the Mount Sinai, and he gave it to Joshua, the son of Nun. Joshua gave it to Judges. Judges gave it to prophets, and prophets gave it to the men of the Great Assembly. And they taught, this men of the Great Assembly, they taught that you should judge fairly and multiply the disciples and create a fence to the Torah. This is a very, very profound, interesting statement that gives us the description of how Rabbinic Judaism has emerged. We already talked about the origin of the rabbis. Rabbis were learned Pharisees, mainly of non-Levitical background, who stepped in as the teachers of the Torah after the victory in the Maccabean Wars, which basically exposed the faults in Levitical priesthood, which became mainly Sadducean and very Hellenistic. And so people lost trust in the priesthood and trusted the rabbis. And so there were three functions which outlined which the rabbis were supposed to do. First function is a judicial function. It's interesting that there is a mention of the so-called Great Assembly. We don't know exactly when it was created, but there are scholars who agree that in the 2nd century BC, during the reign of Yohanan Hyrcanus, that's when the Great Assembly, or the advisory body, was created. The king wanted experts in the Torah to advise him in judicial matters. And so this is how Sanhedrin was created. Sanhedrin was the assembly of 72 rabbis who basically would advise the king on the very important matters concerning the law of the Torah. And in the jurisdiction of the Sanhedrin was the death penalty issue. That's why they needed 72 people to vote unanimously to put some criminal who created a capital offense against the laws of the Torah, to put such people to death. This is a judicial function. The second function is create more disciples. And last lecture we dedicated to the issue of discipleship, which is connected with the system of Jewish education. So disciples were studying the Torah, and those who were the best among the disciples would become rabbis because they would attract to themselves more disciples, while the rest would be just the scribes and the lawyers. And so the third is make a fence around the Torah, siyag Torah. Now, what is the fence around the Torah? That's one of the ways how the ethics is made. What is the ethics? Ethics is the way how to implement the principles of the Torah. For example, take commandment number 4 in the Decalogue. Thou shalt not do any work. What constitutes work in Hebrew malacha? Well, we don't have too many things in the Torah that would explain it. Well, we have one thing, thou shalt not light the fire on Sabbath. That's a good example. But other than that, we have to find the ways. So the rabbis were in charge of implementing these laws and telling people how to live by the Torah. So in the case of the commandment of Sabbath, they would create, they would have a list of 39 particular activities that are forbidden on the Shabbat. This list was based off of the book of Exodus, chapter 25 through 31, because chapter 31 ends with the reminding people of Israel to keep the Sabbath as a sign. And so rabbis deduce that all the work which were to be done at the construction of the sanctuary are forbidden, since at the very end of the section that deals with the construction of the sanctuary, the Sabbath is emphasized. This is one of the examples of how the ethical rules were created. These ethical rules are called oral Torah, and they're mentioned in the Gospels. For example, Mark chapter 7 mentions the washing of the hands, together with the ritual washings of pots and pans and other things. And it says, for the Pharisees following the traditions of elders. So that's a very important phrase. It shows that there was a tradition of elders known in Judaism by simply the oral Torah. In spite of the fact that modern books written by the Orthodox Jewish rabbis try to prove that oral Torah was all given to Moses by God on the Mount of Sinai, we don't have any proof of this. In fact, in the Torah, which we have written, there is no single hint of anything that would Moses had and he wouldn't write down. But on the other hand, and that's what the proponents of Orthodox Judaism emphasize, it's very difficult to implement exactly the commandments of the Torah, because sometimes they're very general and very abbreviated. That's why, while we don't have any examples how these traditions were carried out in a time of, for example, David or King Jehoshaphat or King Josiah, but we do have traditions which begin to be developed by the rabbis beginning of the 2nd century, 1st century BC, 1st century AD. This tradition is eventually becoming what's now known as the Oral Torah.